Channel, Silent Revenge. Duration target, 28 minutes. Voice, ENGB Ryan Neural, Edge TTS. POV, third-person intimate, told from a calm narrator looking at Claire. Source Rotero, Day 35, PDF Chronogrammer. Recurring characters, Claire Bennett, 38, James Bennett, 41, the woman behind the voice command. Setting, Highbury, North London, late September 2025, 1 month before EP14, 3 months before EP12. Climax type, cold archival, Claire downloads the voice history before James can delete it. Tier, Cinematic V2, 30 shots, Character Bible mandatory. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in a kitchen at 3 minutes past 11 on a quiet Sunday morning, when no one in the house has, yet, given an instruction to the small black cylinder on the marble worktop. The house was in Highbury. The cylinder was an Amazon Echo, the second-generation model with the ring of soft amber light at its base. James had bought it 3 years earlier for his birthday. They had used it almost exclusively for two things, playing radio for in the morning while Claire made coffee, and setting kitchen timers when one of them was cooking. That Sunday morning, Claire had gone into the kitchen alone. James had been upstairs in the shower. She had been carrying the small ceramic teapot to the sink to rinse the leaves out. She had not, in any conscious sense, given the cylinder an instruction. She had not pressed the button. She had not said the wake word. The cylinder, however, had spoken. It had said, in the warm neutral female voice of the device, now playing, Saturday evening, your private playlist on Spotify. It had said this exactly 6 seconds after Claire walked into the kitchen. Claire stood at the sink, with a small ceramic teapot in her hand, and she listened to a song she had never heard before begin to play, very softly, from the cylinder. She had not asked for music. She had also, for the avoidance of all doubt, never made a Spotify playlist called Saturday Evening. This is the story of the morning Claire Bennett discovered that someone else had been giving instructions to the small black cylinder on the kitchen worktop of her home, and that the cylinder, in its cheerful unrepentant honesty, had begun to recognize that other voice as one of the household. The song played for perhaps 20 seconds before Claire crossed the kitchen and pressed the small mute button on the top of the device. The cylinder went quiet. The amber ring of light dimmed and disappeared. Claire stood with her hand still resting lightly on the device. She did not, immediately, do anything else. She listened, instead, to the small ordinary sounds of her own house, the boiler ticking once in the wall, the distant rush of water from the bathroom upstairs, a single black taxi rolling slowly past on the wet road outside. She thought, with the small careful interest of a woman who had spent 20 years building a professional habit of suspending judgment until she had read every entry on the card, about the song that had just been playing. The song had been a slow piece, quiet, with an acoustic guitar. The kind of song two people might play at the very end of an evening together when neither of them wanted, yet, to suggest going to bed. It had not, she was almost certain, been a song James had ever played in her presence in 14 years. She picked up her phone from the kitchen island. She opened the small purple icon of the Alexa app. She had not, in 3 years of owning the device, opened the Alexa app more than 2 or 3 times. Once to set the time zone. Once to add a calendar. The app, when it loaded, asked her if she would like to enable a number of features. She tapped past the prompts. She found, in the settings menu, the section called Voice History. She tapped it. The screen filled with a long list, of small grey rectangular boxes, each one a recording of a voice command spoken to the device. The most recent at the top. The oldest at the bottom. The most recent rectangle had been recorded 1 minute and 17 seconds earlier. The text beside the most recent rectangle said, "Alexa, play Saturday Evening." The voice that had said it, when Claire tapped the small play triangle to listen, was not James's voice. It was not Claire's voice either. It was the voice of a woman in her early 30s, with a slight London accent, slightly husky, casual, the kind of voice that issues a request to a smart speaker the way one issues a request to a household one is comfortable in. The voice had spoken the wake word, Alexa, and the playlist name, Saturday Evening, in the perfectly relaxed cadence of a person who had not, that morning, expected anyone except the device to be listening. Claire stood in her own kitchen. The boiler ticked once in the wall. Upstairs, the shower stopped. Claire turned off the screen of her phone, slid it face down onto the kitchen island, and walked, very calmly, to put the kettle on. She did not, in the 7 minutes it took James to come downstairs in his pale grey toweling robe, mention the small black cylinder or the song or the voice. She made him a coffee. She made herself a cup of Earl Grey. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, the way she had sat across from him every Sunday morning for the previous 12 years, and she listened to him tell her, in his slightly elevated lawyerly voice, about an article he had been reading about a contested estate in Dorset. She nodded at the appropriate places. She drank her tea. She did not look at the small black cylinder on the worktop. When James went upstairs to dress, she opened the Alexa app again. She scrolled. She scrolled for a long time. What Claire found, in the half hour of careful scrolling that followed, while her husband moved through the rooms of their house, performing the small Sunday rituals of a man who believed he was alone in his interpretation of his own life, was this. The small black cylinder had recorded, in the previous 9 months, 473 voice commands. Of those commands, 291 had been spoken in James's voice. They were, almost exclusively, the kinds of commands a man gives in the morning when he is alone in a kitchen: a request for a weather report, a request to play Radio 4, a kitchen timer for poaching an egg. Of those commands, 86 had been spoken in Claire's voice. They were what she expected, the small ordinary domestic instructions of 14 years of marriage. Of those commands, 96 had been spoken in a third voice. The third voice was the woman with the slight London accent. Of those 96 commands, the earliest had been recorded on the 4th of January, on a Wednesday evening at 23 minutes past 9. Claire had been at a research dinner in Bloomsbury that evening. She had not got home until shortly before midnight. The most recent, before that morning's Saturday evening, had been recorded on the previous Wednesday at 11 minutes past 10, while Claire had been visiting her sister in Edinburgh. The commands fell into 4 broad categories. Approximately a third of them were music, playlists, individual songs, a particular kind of soft acoustic ballad Claire had never heard. Alexa, play Saturday Evening. Alexa, skip this song. Alexa, turn it down a bit. Approximately a quarter were thermostat commands. Alexa, set the heating to 22. Alexa, turn the bedroom radiator on. The thermostat commands were almost always issued in winter. They were, Claire understood now, the commands of a person who had been cold inside Claire's own house and had felt at liberty to adjust the temperature. Approximately a quarter were kitchen timers and, on 3 occasions, recipe questions. Alexa, how long do I roast a chicken at 180 Celsius? Alexa, set a timer for 25 minutes. The recipe questions were the ones that, when Claire listened to them, she found that she did not, in fact, immediately mind in the cold administrative way one might expect. They were the calm voice of a person who, on a number of evenings, had cooked a meal in Claire's kitchen, for Claire's husband, using Claire's pots, on Claire's stove. Approximately a fifth were one further category. Claire listened to them slowly. The 5th category was a series of small late-evening requests. Alexa, dim the lights. Alexa, lock the front door. Alexa, play something romantic. They had been recorded between 11 at night and 1 in the morning. They had not, Claire understood now, been recorded in Claire's absence. They had been recorded, on at least 3 occasions, on evenings when Claire had been asleep upstairs in the spare bedroom because she had been recovering from a cold. Claire, that morning, did not feel anger. She felt, instead, the cold quiet curiosity of a librarian who had finally discovered the misfiled card she had been searching for, not because of what it said about the woman who had made the misfiling, but because of what it said about the man who had quietly handed her the keys to the wrong cabinet. She closed the app. She stood up from the kitchen table. She did not, on that Sunday morning, do anything else with the recordings. But before she went to the supermarket on Highbury Park, she did one very small administrative thing. She opened the Alexa app one more time. She tapped Voice History, Manage Your Data, Download My Voice History. The app, very politely, said it would email her the file. By the time she came back from the supermarket 40 minutes later carrying a punnet of strawberries and a bunch of basil, the email had arrived. The file was 48 megabytes. It contained, the email said, every voice command issued to the small black cylinder on the kitchen worktop since the day it had been activated. Claire saved the file to a folder on her laptop called Library Citations 2025. It became, that morning, the second of 19 documents the folder would eventually hold. She did not, that day, mention to James that she had downloaded it. What Claire understood about the device, in the quiet weeks that followed, was that it had, without anyone in the household having explicitly trained it to, quietly learned the voice of a third person. The Echo, in its modern incarnations, learned the voices of frequent users. It associated, with each recognized voice, a small profile, a name, a calendar, a music account. Most households used this to distinguish a husband's reminders from a wife's. On Claire's Echo, in the small voice profile section of the settings, there were three. There was James. There was Claire. And there was a third profile, which had been created automatically by the device on the 17th of February, after the new voice had given it instructions on enough separate occasions for the device to politely conclude that this was a third member of the household. The third profile had been given a default name by the device. It had been named, simply, Voice Profile 3. The third profile, when Claire tapped on it, was linked to a Spotify account she did not recognize. The Spotify account was registered to an email address that ended in a domain Claire had never seen on any Christmas card or invitation in 14 years of marriage. The display name on the Spotify account was a single first name. It was the first name Claire would later learn from the message thread on the Navy sofa in the flat in Camden, for months after this Sunday morning, was the full version of the letter L. She did not, that morning, change the third voice profile. She did not delete it. She did not unlink the Spotify account. What she did was screenshot every page of the voice profile section, in order, and add the screenshots to the Library Citations 2025 folder beneath the voice history file. She closed the laptop. She put the kettle on for the second time that morning. She made herself a fresh cup of Earl Grey. She sat at the kitchen table, looking at the small black cylinder on the worktop, and she thought, with a kind of cold, quiet, almost professional respect, that this small device was, of all the things in the architecture of her marriage, the only one that had behaved with absolute integrity. The cylinder had not lied to her. The cylinder had recorded everything. The cylinder had been told, in the same kitchen in which Claire had cooked her husband his Sunday omelettes for 14 years, the instructions of another woman, and the cylinder had simply, dutifully, carried out those instructions, and added the voice to the household. The cylinder, Claire understood now, had been more honest with her than her husband had been in 9 months. She did not break the cylinder. She did not, in fact, ever speak to it about it. She continued, every Sunday morning of the autumn and winter that followed, to ask it to play radio for while she made coffee. It did. It also continued, on Wednesdays and Sundays when Claire was out, to play Saturday Evening for the woman whose voice it had learned to recognize. Every single one of those plays was now logged in a folder on Claire's laptop. Late one Friday evening in early November, on a night Claire had been out at the launch of a small academic monograph in Bloomsbury, James had set the Echo a kitchen timer. The timer had been for 45 minutes. The voice command had been, in James's calm professional voice, Alexa, set a timer for 45 minutes. What was unusual about the recording, when Claire listened to it later, was not the timer itself. What was unusual was the second voice in the background of the recording. The recording was about 4 seconds long. The Echo's microphones picked up, while James spoke, a very faint female voice from somewhere off to the left of the kitchen. The voice was speaking softly, the way one speaks when one does not wish to be heard by a recording device. What the female voice was saying, very quietly, in the half-second after James finished giving the timer command, was, "She'll be back at 11:30, won't she?" We've got time. Claire listened to the 4-second recording 3 times in a row, sitting at the kitchen table in the cold blue glow of her laptop on the Saturday morning after she had downloaded that month's voice history. She did not cry. She did not, even, particularly tighten her jaw. She thought, with the calm cold clarity of a librarian holding a piece of physical evidence in her hand, about the shape of those 8 words. The casualness of them. The we. The got time. The 11:30. The woman in the background of the recording had not been frightened. She had not been newly arrived. She had been a woman who knew the shape of Claire's evening, the time of Claire's likely return, and the comfortable margin of her own remaining presence in Claire's kitchen. The woman had been, in the precise meaning of the term, at home. Claire saved the 4-second clip into the folder. She did not play it for anyone. She did not, in fact, play it for anyone for 19 weeks. She played it for Helen Whitcomb, in a meeting room on the 2nd floor of a Chambers in Lincoln's Inn, on a cold afternoon in late March, on a small Bluetooth speaker Helen had brought to the meeting precisely for this purpose. The slightly younger solicitor across the table from them did not, at first, understand what he was hearing. When he did, he closed his folder very carefully. He said, "Could I ask for a short break?" Helen, with the same small professional smile she had used the day Helen had handed over the printed message thread, said, "Of course." When the slightly younger solicitor came back 15 minutes later, the financial settlement was, very politely, adjusted again. Helen Whitcomb, that afternoon, did not need to argue. She only needed to press play. There was one further detail of the morning the echo had spoken to Claire. When she had stood in the kitchen at 11:03 on the Sunday morning, with a song called Saturday Evening playing softly from the small black cylinder, and the amber ring of light glowing at its base, she had not, in any conscious sense, given the device an instruction. But that was not, exactly, true. In the corner of the kitchen, in the small area near the fridge where Claire had been reaching, 2 minutes earlier, for the kettle, there had been a brief moment in which she had, in passing, said to herself, "Right. Tea." The echo, in the modern way of its kind, had been listening. The echo had not, of course, mistaken her for Elle. But, faintly, fleetingly, the echo had picked up a snatch of her voice and, in some small algorithmic shrug of its modern training, had decided, perhaps, to respond. It had not played her the radio. It had not played her her own News in 30 playlist. It had played her Saturday Evening, the playlist that another woman had added to the household. The echo had, very faintly, without intent, handed Claire the song that her husband and his lover had been listening to in her own kitchen for 9 months. It was the small kind of accident on which long marriages had, throughout history, ended. It was also, Claire understood now, the moment her own period of suspicion had stopped being a private 9-month research project, and become, simply, a record. She did not, in the months that followed, ever ask the cylinder to play Saturday Evening herself. She did not, in the months that followed, ever ask the cylinder for a specific song at all. She continued to ask it, every morning, for Radio 4. The echo continued, every morning, to comply. On the evening before Helen Whitcomb pressed play on the 4-second recording in the meeting room in Lincoln's Inn, Claire sat in the kitchen of the house in Highbury alone for the first time in 14 years. James had moved out 3 weeks before, to the flat in Camden. The kitchen looked, in most respects, exactly the way it had always looked. The small black cylinder still sat on the marble worktop. The cookbook on Italian regional cuisine still sat on the alcove shelf. The framed photograph of Claire's mother still sat beside it. Claire put the kettle on. She made herself a cup of Earl Grey. She sat at the kitchen table. She picked up her phone. She opened the Alexa app. She navigated, slowly, to the small section called Voice Profiles. There were now only 2 profiles. James had been deleted 3 weeks before, the day Claire had asked him to leave. He had, before he handed her the spare key in the front hall, asked her, very politely, whether she wanted him to remove his profile from the device. She had said, yes. And the third one as well. He had paused for half a second. He had said, of course. He had deleted, that afternoon, the profile of Elle, believing, in the small, polite, lawyerly way of a man who had not yet realized what was in the folder on her laptop, that he was thereby removing the woman from the record of the device. What he had not understood was that Claire had downloaded the voice history file the morning of the Echo's mistake 8 months earlier, and that the file existed not on the device, but on a hard drive in a kitchen drawer beside the kettle. The device had been cleaned. The record had not. It would never be. In late March, in the meeting room on the second floor of a Chambers in Lincoln's Inn, Helen Whitcomb pressed play on the small Bluetooth speaker on the polished walnut table. The 4-second recording filled the room. A man's calm voice. "Alexa, set a timer for 45 minutes. A faint female voice in the background, casual, comfortable. "She'll be back at 11:30, won't she? We've got time." The slightly younger solicitor closed his folder. He asked for a short break. When the meeting reconvened, the settlement was adjusted, very politely, in Claire Bennett's favor. Walking out of Lincoln's Inn that afternoon, into the cold March air, Helen Whitcomb said, "That's the most unusual evidence I have entered into proceedings this year." Claire said, "It wasn't difficult to find." Helen smiled. "It rarely is, when one knows where to look." Claire walked on across the gravel of Lincoln's Inn Fields. The bare plane tree stood overhead. The wet pavements caught the cold light. She walked